welcome to Sorry Is This Boring?
I'm Natalie.
I'm Marika.
Today we are going to be talking about the film River's Edge. It's the 1986 sort of cult film by director Tim Hunter. It's about a high school slacker commits a shocking act and proceeds to let his friends in on the secret. However, the friends' reaction is almost as ambiguous and perplexing as the crime itself. Uh, Major spoilers ahead, as per usual. If you haven't seen this film, I suggest you watch it now.
So, first interesting thing I found out when researching this film is that the screenwriter of the film, Neil Jimenez, based it off of a real life murder that he read about in the paper when he was in college. It took place in 1981 in a town called Milpitas, California. It was like the rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl named Marcy Conrad by a boy named Anthony Jacques Broussard. He read this in the paper and inspired him to write this screenplay. And
Do you know if there was any sort of clear similarities between that murder and the movie? Just besides just the fact that it was the murder of a girl.
I believe that there was a lot of similarities. Well, one main difference was that in real life, the boy that committed the murder was black, and they changed that in the script. I feel like for obvious reasons. And I read that they screened the film in the town, near the town where the real murder took place, and there was a lot of obviously resentment. They were like, why are you bringing this back up? We don't want to be known for this awful crime. But then people the principal of the school, for example, came up to them afterwards, and they were like, the kids were exactly like this. You depicted it really well.
Wow.
Which is pretty cool, I think, So I think it was probably, not too far off the real life story. Obviously he created the group of characters not totally based on real life, more based on his own experiences of his friends from high school, an example. And something that's also interesting is that the script I read was sort of floating around Hollywood for 3 years, and it was kind of a hard sell just because of how, I guess, dark it was. But then Tim Hunter, the director, he read it, and initially he was not looking to do another teen film because he'd already done a couple of teen films, but then he read the script and lobbied for it right away because he loved it. This is the director Tim Hunter's third film that he made. He is a filmmaker. Tim Hunter is Los Angeles born, and he's the son of a screenwriter, so he's in the movie business. He went to Harvard and to AFI, so he's are both very elite. AFI is really elite in terms of film. But this is his third film. His first film is called Text, that came out in 1982, and his second film was called Sylvester, that came out in 1985. And then he made another film after this called Paint It Black in 1989. But after that, he has had a very long career working in television. That's mostly what he's done. And he's very recently, in 2018, made a new film called The Looking Glass with Nicolas Cage, which sounds really cool, actually. But yeah, he's actually worked on so many TV shows. He's really big. He's directed episodes of Twin Peaks. He's directed even episodes of Riverdale and Pretty Little Liars and American Horror Story and Breaking Bad and Dexter and Hannibal.
Holy shit.
Yeah. And he's definitely, you could tell he's drawn to sort of a specific genre. And one thing a lot of his work has in common is just the dark side of small towns, as well as outsiders and delinquents and stuff. But yeah, Tim Hunter really is a veteran filmmaker, would be the best way to describe it. Some interesting things about the pre-production of the film, and when they were casting it, one thing that I read that Hunter was talking about was casting the part of Feck was a little bit challenging. They sent it to a couple people who rejected it, and they wanted John Lithgow originally to play it, but he rejected it because it was too dark. And then they really wanted Dennis Hopper, but they didn't have the money because it was quite a small budget film. This film was made for 1.7 million, which is a small budget. That sounds ridiculous, but it is a small budget. But yeah, so they really wanted Dennis Hopper, but they didn't have the money. So apparently Hunter threatened to cast Timothy Carey, and the reason
who's Timothy Carey? I feel like I've never seen this man's before in my life. What is he in?
I mean, I've never seen anything he's in. But that's not
Oh, I actually did see Beach Blanket Bingo one time. At a friend's house in, like, elementary school.
Well, there you go.
It was really bad.
So, he threatened to cast Timothy Carey, famously from Beach Blanket Bingo, you might say.
As you all know.
As everybody's seen. But he's famous in Hollywood for being very disruptive and, like, unable to stick to a script and constantly ad-libbing. So, the threat of this to the studio, like, made them, like, come up with the money so they could get Hopper, presumably because they didn't want the script to just, like, get thrown out the window, which I thought was really funny. Another thing that's interesting is that one of the other hard roles to cast was Jamie. So Jamie, who's played by Danny Dietz, but it was hard, obviously, because the role requires just, like, lying naked in the cold for days on end. But I think she's the real unsung hero.
Yeah, 100%.
Another interesting thing I was reading about was the casting of Crispin Glover. Like, when this film came out in 1986, it was, like, really, like, Keanu Reeves' like, third film, and he was not thought of as a big name, which is funny now because people, like, will be like, oh, that Keanu Reeves film, because he's become such a big name. But at the time, he wasn't, like, as big as Crispin Glover and Dennis Hopper. Mm-hmm. And Crispin Glover had, like, just gotten off of Back to the Future, where he plays Marty McFly's, like, dad, the younger version of his dad. So he was, like, quite well known at this point. And I was reading an interview with the director, and he was saying how when he came in for his audition, he was, like, already, like, the character you see in the movie, and he was, like, wearing a wig, and he was, like, full on. And they sort of, like, had to decide, because they knew, like, this performance, like, was kind of gonna affect the film in a way, and they decided to go with it. And they also said that, you know, like, getting Glover was, like, a big catch for them because he was so big at the time, or, like, one of the bigger names at the time. But it's something that is interesting that in reading interviews is that Glover's performance in the film actually came off as quite, like, controversial. And I read an article from, like, LA Times that came out, like, in 1986, and it was saying how a lot of people, like, faulted his performance for throwing the film off of balance, and the director responded saying that he thinks Crispin's performance adds dimensions to the film, and I'm happy to see that it's aroused some controversy. He also said that, I feel a bit like Reagan being asked if he was aware what the North was doing right under his nose. Which is also a very 1980s quote.
Yeah.
A reference, you might say. But yeah, I think it's funny that a lot of people responded to his performance because it is very big in the film. But I like that, you know, it was, like, clearly very intentional. Oh yeah, another interesting thing is just that this film, you know, it was made on a small budget, but it did really, really well in the box office when it came out. Like, it was a big success. And I remember, like, Hunter was, like, very apprehensive of jinxing it. Like, in all his interviews, he talks about, like, worrying about jinxing the success of the film. But it did really well. The director, Hunter, in an interview said, "One of the things that drew me to this project was its unsettling combination of Fritz Lang-style social melodrama and surrealist black comedy. It was a challenge to try to capture both those things at once. And in making the film, we had quite a good time doing much of it because we were all keenly aware of the heavy overlay of black humor." And so I thought that was, like, a good way to sum it up because it really is, like, surrealist black comedy. And I also thought the comparison he made to Fritz Lang was quite interesting.
I guess one thing I wanted to say before we got into it was just that I was introduced to this film through my mom because it's one of her favorite films. And she said that it was kind of something, I mean, hopefully I'm not sort of quoting her wrong, but she said that it was something she related to a lot from when she was in high school, because she was kind of a teenager in like the 80s. And she would always recommend me to watch it, and she was like, you will like this film, I know you'll like it. And I was always like, no, because with the way that she described it to me is that in the beginning it's, this, like, the first thing that happens is you just see this girl dead, and then this guy is just bragging about killing his girlfriend, and it's all about them dealing with that. And I found that to be very depressing sounding, and I felt like my mom would always recommend me sad films, and I'm a very sensitive, emotional person, so I try to avoid movies that are too sad or depressing. But I was at, I think it was Half Price Books, either that or Disc Replay, just some store in the suburbs that sells DVDs, and I saw a DVD copy of it, and I felt like it was kind of weird because there was just like one of them, and I'd never seen it anywhere else, and so I decided to buy it and watch it, and I loved it, and I still love it to this day, and I think it's really cool that something that my mom was really struck by and really related to when she was a teenager could also affect me in the same way.
Yeah, I think, this film definitely isn't a tragedy, even though so much tragic things happen. Like, it's fun. And I think, like, a lot of that's but just because of, like, how deadpan, I guess I would describe a lot of it is. And,
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the point, because it is something that's quite sad. The fact that you're meant to feel a bit detached from it is like what the characters themselves are feeling about the situation. So it sort of like mirrors it in that way, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sort of lack of melodrama works really well for it, and I think it hits home the sort of points that it's trying to make.
Yeah, and like the lack of emotion of all the characters, it's like the point of it all.
I guess the first thing is that the way I view this film, like just in addition to sort of what we've said about it being a cult film and things like that, is I kind of see it as both an existential stoner film and a metal film. The very first thing you see on screen is like this gritty, sort of grainy, I don't really know how to describe it. There's like that effect on Premiere. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where it kind of makes everything like basically black and white more than just the whole grayscale. But yeah, it's kind of more of that effect, and then right after that you just see this kid in like a denim jacket with an earring who's like 11 years old throwing a baby doll into the river, and I feel like those things kind of set the tone for like how I see it as this metal film.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting that I also read was that for like the soundtrack for this film, because like they had no money, like well, they had money, but they said they had so little money that they couldn't afford any music. But then there's like a label. It was called the Enigma slash Metal Blade, and they like got on board and donated their whole catalog, which is like Slayer, Fate's Warning, Corrosion of Conformity, and The Wipers, Agent Orange. Like they got all those songs for the soundtrack.
Sick.
Yeah.
And I feel like it would probably cost a lot more money to get those bands now
Yeah.
than it would have been. Something I wrote, I guess, more at the beginning is that something we were talking about fairly recently was the idea that there's a lot of films out there that have some sort of female friendship, and there's one female that idolizes the other or puts them on a pedestal. And we were trying to think of films where there's male characters that do the same thing, and we had kind of a hard time thinking of films with that concept, but with the reversal of genders. I think something that definitely is a part of this film, maybe not in the way that it's like a true friendship, but the Matt's little brother, who's, you know, the very first person you see in the film, has this weird sort of dichotomy of, it seems like he idolizes his older brother and their friends, and tries to sort of be on their level, tries to get them to respect him.
Yeah.
For, you know, things like stealing and, like, knowing dirty secrets and smoking weed and...
Yeah, like, at the opening of the film, he, like, sees John, who's he knows is, like, from his brother's friend group, trying to buy beer, and the guy's like, you don't have an ID. So he steals some beer and, like, puts it in his car and then, like gives it to him, and it's like he's just like constantly trying to like be a part of the group, but his sort of like the rejection manifests in like him being just like this little shit.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about taking things too far as well.
Yeah,
which I think is definitely a theme that carries on throughout the film, but you know, a lot of things he does is to get respect and then ends up making his brother disrespect him more.
Yeah.
You know?
Another interesting thing, like, about that scene is that he's, like, the little brother asked John, like, where, like, if he has weed, and he's like, no, but, like, I know where we can get some. And he's like, get in. And, I feel like watching it, it's funny because you've just seen, like, the beginning of the film, you see John, like, next to the naked body, like, smoking a joint, and then he, like, picks up her clothes and walks away. And then, like, this is the next scene that you see him in. And, like, I feel like there's, like, this little boy that's, like, getting in the car. But I feel like I never was worried, you know? Even though I feel like if it was, like, another show, like, those two things together would be worrying. You'd be like, is this little boy about to get murdered?
Yeah.
But that's, like, never something that I felt. It's, like, interesting, you know? I think John... Even though, like, also because you don't see the murder, you never see any scenes with Jamie alive, you're not, like, expecting him to do anything. He seems, you know, he is so passive for most of the movie. He's not scary.
But I think there definitely is something that is a little bit scary about how passive he is, you know, and just sort of disassociated. And I think it really reflects a lot of ideas. I don't know if we've talked about it on the show, but just we've talked about it personally, about when sort of tragedies happen with youth, like youth committing crimes or murder and things like that, and people just wanting to know why and making up these narratives for them. And I feel like that kind of idea is definitely reflected in here, and there's a lot of times when people sort of ask him why he did it, and that's kind of the first idea that comes into your head, which is totally natural, and a lot of times he just, you know, says, I don't know, or says, oh, she was talking shit, and none of it seems, like, real or tangible or believable.
Yeah.
And so it just leaves the whole thing as this enigma where people just feel like they'll never really understand why this thing happened, and it still happened anyways.
Yeah. And I feel like something that's, like, interesting about the film is that there really is no villains in it, even though there's, like, a murderer. I feel like he doesn't read like a villain. Mm-hmm. Like, nobody really is to blame. I mean, like, obviously John is literally to blame, but I you know, I feel sorry for him still. Like, all of these kids just, like, don't have, like, the proper tools and skills to, like, deal with the murder. So, like, you could see how, like, John is also not having these, like, resources that he might need that have, like, helped him cope with whatever he's going through, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And, like, you do find out some stuff about him, like, his, like, mother's dead, and he's, like, you see him, like, living with his sick aunt who he has to take care of. So it's, like, clear that he doesn't have, you know, much of a support system or, like, people to notice, like, what's going on with him.
Yeah.
And also just that, like, Jamie, you know, like, you really see, like, you only ever see her dead body, and you see one picture of her in one of the girls' rooms. But you don't, you know, she really is just, like, a dead body. She's
Mm-hmm.
not a person. Like, people never talk about her at all, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's people that say, you know, she was my friend, but
Yeah.
there's never any sort of stories about
Yeah.
people doing things with her, what she was like.
Nobody even ever expresses, like, deep sadness that she's dead. It's like, even her friends, like, even Clarissa, she's like, she says, like, I cried at the end of this movie. Like, why shouldn't I cry about Jamie? Like, she, like, expresses never, like, quite, like, deep sadness that her friend is dead. It's more like just annoyance at everybody else.
But I think she also expresses annoyance with herself, just in the way that she doesn't understand why she feels so apathetic towards it, you
Mm-hmm.
know? Which I think is really interesting in itself.
Yeah.
I guess, like, something I kind of wonder about the film as well is if it was any of the other people in their friend group, would it have the same outcome? Or do you think it's, like, specific to this one friend that maybe nobody was actually really friends with? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like it could have easily been, like, some of, like, the more minor characters, you know? Because they're, like, you know, like, there's Clarissa's friend whose, like, name I don't even know. Like, does she even have a name? She's in, like, a couple of scenes. I think, like, it's definitely something about the fact that it's a woman is important. About how dismissive it is, you know?
I agree with that.
Because, like, also, like, something that I, like, kept reminding myself, like, watching the film is that, like, nobody's upset that this girl has been murdered. Like, even her female friends. Like, you know? And, like, that's the point of it. You're meant to be, like, not totally fully understanding of them because, like, just the fact that this, like, man has killed this girl and, like, the fact that they're even talking about, like, covering it up is, like, makes me mad because, like, it's a girl that's been murdered.
And I think that even Clarissa sort of acknowledges that a lot in the film, which is something that I find really interesting. There's a lot of times when she talks about, you know, just the fact that why are all these boys so bent on covering things up for John, saving John, when Jamie was our friend too.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And then she talks about things like, you know, that why aren't we acting like he's a dangerous person? You know, what if he kills me next? Or things like that, you know, her being, like, one of the few girls in this group of friends.
Yeah.
And she even, when she's confronting Lane in the car, and she's talking about how Lane has this fantasy of them being sort of partners in crime. She makes this whole thing about, oh, why don't you just kill me and strap me to the top of the car, and then you could show me off all around town. And I think that is definitely something that I think really is tied to the fact of it being a girl and this idea of it, like, showing this body off like an object.
Yeah.
You know?
You know, like, a big thing is that not just that he keeps bringing people to see this dead body, it's that he keeps bringing people to see this, like, naked woman who's a dead body as well.
Yeah. There's one scene near the end that's a flashback of him killing Jamie, and she has her clothes on. And, you know, my sort of thought, you know, throughout most of the film is that they were having sex at the river's edge, and then he decided to murder her.
Yeah.
But the fact that he clearly took her clothes off after she was dead is very strange.
Yeah.
And pretty disturbing.
They also, like, that scene is intercut with, like, Clarissa having sex with Keanu Reeves.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know his name in the film.
Matt.
Matt. With Clarissa having sex with Matt, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It almost like feels like something that was like he was like trying to make it more provocative, you know? Because like he wanted people to come and see this naked dead girl, you know? He like never wanted to hide the body. He never like he wanted people to come see it. He wanted people to know, you know?
Yeah.
He didn't want to stop people from telling anyone. He never tried, you know?
Uh-huh.
And a lot of like times in the film, I sort of like felt like it was kind of like he was like hoping for sort of like you know, like some kind of death by cough or something, like suicide by cough or something, you know?
Yeah.
Like I think it is like some sort of cry for help or something.
Definitely.
That he experiences. Like it's Lane that's leading a lot of the things about like protecting him, because like Lane's way of dealing with it in his mind is to like, you know, is to like cling to this idea that they have to protect their friend, you know, like loyalty and stuff. In a way, you could look at it as like Lane is the one that is like most affected by this death, because like he reacts in an extreme way, and like yeah, he's like an extreme person, but it is like an extreme reaction, and he goes to like extreme lengths to try and like protect John and deal with these things. And I think like a lot of it's probably just like his own way of like trying to cope with what's the trauma of like seeing this like dead friend, you know. And so I think that's interesting, because like even though like he sort of like reacted in sort of like the opposite way of like thinking about Jamie, but he's like the only one that's like really doing anything. Like everyone else is so passive in the movie, and like even though he's doing these like, misguided things, he's the only one who's like really doing anything.
Yeah, because I feel like every character in the movie has a sort of different way of disassociating, I guess, and dealing with that. And as well, I feel like all of them go through some sort of emotional change, or just, you know, acknowledgement of what's going on. That's why I kind of feel like this film is very existential in a way.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in the idea of this sort of selfishness in dealing with this crime, it allows everyone to be sort of super self-reflective.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting. And so I was wondering if maybe we should go into each of the main characters and sort of talk about, you know, their portrayal and their journey and change. So we kind of started talking about Tim already, Matt's little brother,
yeah.
But I don't know, would you want to get into his sort of journey first?
Yeah. I mean, well, we talked about, you know, his idolization of like his brother and his friends, and how, you know, makes them act like a little shit, basically, you know. And he does like a bunch of extreme things in this quest, I guess. You know, he steals a gun, and he like attacks Feck, and steals a car, and
steals weed, breaks into a house.
Yeah. But it ultimately, you know, it ends like quite dramatically with like his little brother like holding up Matt at gunpoint. You know, that's sort of like a long build to that happening, like him with the gun, like you're like waiting for finally like something to happen, and then like so quickly he's like Matt is able to just talk him down.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting. Like it just was so easy for him to be like, I'm your brother. And because like that's, I think like it's all he wanted really.
Yeah.
Was just to be accepted, you know, by Matt, like showing some kind of affection or, you know, recognition.
Because the whole time he's just asking, you know, if he can go hang out with him and his friends, go wherever they're going. And, you know, every time there's that big scene when Matt starts punching him in the face for wrecking his little sister's grave for her baby doll, and the little brother is throwing death threats at Matt,
Mhm.
and, you know, he's just so upset that someone, you know, he idolizes could just disrespect him so much, you know, because, like, all he wants is respect.
And there's also, like, the element of, like, they have, like, their parents are the only ones in the film that we meet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, like, the mother and just, like, this, like, kind of shitty boyfriend who pays the rent but is an asshole and seems like a real piece of shit. And they're sort of up against him.
And I think something that's really funny is when Matt's coming home from something and Tim and his friend are hanging out outside the house, and Matt's like, "Why are you guys such delinquents?" And Tim's like, "'Cause of our fucked up childhoods." And it's really funny to hear that out of a child's mouth.
Yeah.
You know? Just, it's really, like, quick-witted. And very, sort of self-referential
Yeah.
for a child to say. But I think that's something that's almost just so interesting about the whole film in general, is the ability for these kids to be so self-referential.
Yeah, because it makes it, like, so deadpan, the things they say,
Uh-huh.
like, you know, and it's funny.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just the fact that I feel like this film is just so wrapped around in these sort of aimless teens. Something that's really nice about it is that there are little glimmers of hope throughout it, which I think is just definitely very reflective of just how kids were seen at the time. Is just so hopeless. That sort of last scene with the brother holding up the gun and Matt being able to talk him down pretty easily, it just brings that sort of the child back into this kid who you feel like is just going off the rails.
I know, because I, like, really hated this little fucking kid the whole film. Like, he was so annoying. And then, like, at the end, like, it was, like, nice to see them, like, you know, have a moment.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing that I think about the film is that it's, like, so, like, grunge, you know? Something about it feels so grunge, but I feel like it was, like, a little bit, like, ahead of its time in that way. Like, in terms of media, anyway, you know?
Yeah, because I feel like after the early 90s, there was a lot of films of, you know, people in the Pacific Northwest, you know.
And I think that's, like, one of the reasons this film is so popular is probably because, like, people, like, obviously, like, look back on, like, grunge with such nostalgia. And this is, like, you know, an early, like, example of it, I think. Or I hold quite highly.
Definitely. Something I found really interesting about Matt's journey throughout the film is that there's this dynamic between the murder of Jamie and his little sister's dead doll. And whereas, you know, he is shown as someone who is sort of detached throughout the film, where he thinks it's wrong what happened to Jamie, but he isn't very active in doing anything about it, and he feels sort of afraid of his friends finding out that he took any action against this friend for doing something that we all know is morally wrong. And so I feel like, in a way, him sort of dealing with his sister's doll is a way for him to control his life. You know what I mean? And I think, as well, with the whole scene where he goes to the police, and because he's trying to do something right, and he ends up being held and questioned by the cops, and them trying to turn everything on him.
Yeah.
And so it just feels like this huge lack of control, his inability to be taken seriously and to do anything right.
Yeah.
When he feels like his life is so fucked up. And I think for him to sort of you know, make this grave marker for this missing doll and go to the funeral and, you know, give words to it and give flowers is something that's like, you know, he's so involved in that
Yeah.
throughout the film, and he gets so upset when his brother does these things.
Yeah.
That I feel like it's sort of reflective of his own life and his inability to control it. He can't beat up the cops, he can't beat up his friend John, but he can beat up his little brother for doing those shitty things, you know?
Yeah. There's like one scene at the end that I like wrote something about where he like is like just had sex with Clarissa in the park, and he says to her, he's like, I'm so glad we went against Lane. And she's like, yeah. But like I remember like thinking like that like when did they do that? Like they didn't really, you know, like he like kicked Clarissa out of the car and he just like followed her. I don't know.
I think it just, again, has to do with the idea of just the inability of controlling things, and so, you know, for them to just have this mutual idea that they don't agree with Lane feels like something that's really monumental, you
Yeah.
know? Even though they're both just like, oh, but don't tell anyone, you
Yeah.
know?
And another thing that was like I wanted to mention was like there's like the scene later on in the film where the teacher just like loses his shit and starts like yelling at all the kids, and he says like, and Clarissa too, and he's saying how like what do you feel that she's dead? Like, do you feel anything? Like, do you care? And he was like, I don't think you do, because if you did, you would be out there looking for John or something, you know, or you wouldn't be here. And I feel like that was like interesting too, cause like he like is sort of doing the extreme version of what they're all kind of doing, which is like judging each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're like I feel like everyone is kind of like judging each other, and he does mention it. He's like, oh, it's just like an excuse to feel like self-righteous or superior, and I feel like there is like an element of that that's true. Like they're all sort of like are trying to like they sort of are judging each other and the way that their friends are dealing with it, but at the same time like nobody's really doing like a lot for Jamie, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like none of them have really done much at all, and like there's nothing wrong with that, because like obviously like, you know, it's like a hard thing to deal with. Like no one has like there's no right way to do things or wrong way, but yeah, like there definitely is an element of what he says that's like true.
Yeah. I mean, it's just kind of like what I was saying before, is that there's definitely a reason for the way things happen in the film and the characters, you know, there's this theme
Yeah.
that's being presented to us. I just feel like, you know, I like to give the characters more of the benefit of the doubt, because, you know, it's supposed to be a black comedy. If they were all like really scared for their lives,
Yeah.
or
I mean, like-
crying all the time, you know, it wouldn't be funny.
Yeah, no, obviously, like, if it was, like, realistic, like, it wouldn't be very fun at all.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
Like, it's just, like, is, like, the combination of, like, idle adolescent, like, self-absorption with, like, something really serious happening.
Mm-hmm.
And how, like, they don't really mix. Those two things don't mix well.
Yeah, which is what makes it funny and what makes it existential, and,
Yeah.
you know, I think there is truth to it, you know, but it's
Yeah.
definitely sort of pushed forward in this wild way to make it funny. Yeah, I mean, especially with, because I feel like her sort of most self-referential moment is the moment when the teacher is screaming in the class, you know, just, you know, she sort of knows that she doesn't feel as sad as she wishes she did, but to have that idea sort of yelling in your face is, you know, really intense.
Something interesting about Lane, like, obviously I already mentioned that, you know, like, a lot of people were, like, put off by his performance. But something interesting that the director said is, I have a quote, he said, It shifted the moral balance for me. Before, on the page, the Dennis Hopper character, Feck, was the most extreme amoral character in the piece. But once Crispin came in with that interpretation of the part, Hopper almost becomes the moral center of the film and completely changed the dynamic of it. I remember half a dozen times shooting River's Edge, having occasional skirmishes with Crispin to pull him back down a little bit from extreme line readings, but basically we knew what we were getting. I let him run with it and all the eccentricities of that performance. He was very generous with the other actors. He wasn't grandstanding in any way. It didn't get in anybody else's way, and everybody loved working with him.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I feel like his character, I think it adds so much to just the general chaos of the film, and I think if he was sort of as calm as Matt is portrayed, I think there would be a lot more of this division between the kids and John, and then the kids and Feck. So something I think is interesting is that, the whole time, kind of like what we said, is that he's, I think not only is he sort of seen as this leader in the film, but he's also trying really hard to be that leader, and sort of the most loyal friend. And I think in a way he's kind of puts himself into this position of a martyr, which I think is really interesting. A lot of times he's just talking about how, we need to be loyal, and I feel like I'm doing everything. And there's this whole thing where he's talking about how he tied up the loose ends for John, and they're in the car, and he's like, oh, you owe me, I should get a sixer for this. And because he got rid of the body, and he's complaining about how the beer's warm, and John's like, I didn't ask you to do anything, and, he's trying to put himself in this position that he's, doing everything he can for his friend, and nobody else is, and he should be thanked for it.
And John really is just, along for the ride,
But I think there's something so great about, him just sort of being this larger-than-life character. He sort of, in a way that you were talking about, where, he does seem to be one of the few characters that show a lot of emotions.
Yeah.
And I think he does have this sort of disillusionment right after he sees the body, and he's talking about how it's like a movie, and I think that's honestly one of the greatest scenes of the entire movie, is that he's talking about the situation in the movie being like a movie, and how it's sort of talking about the themes, how it tests friendships, and to see if they can prove to be loyal, I think any time when there's characters in a movie sort of talking about something fucked up that happens as being like a movie, it kind of shows that disconnection with reality, sort of like in Scream. When Billy is like, oh, everything's just one big movie, and then he ends up being the murderer.
And if Lane wasn't in this film, it wouldn't be funny.
I mean, I think it would still be funny,
I
think he's definitely a big part of it.
I feel like so much of the funniest parts are, people's interactions with him and things he says.
That's just, really nice about his journey is, when he just, puts himself in this martyr position, and then at the end, when he finds John dead, he's the only character who has this, visceral, emotional experience, and he's just wailing and crying.
Yeah, and it's also, this whole time, he's the only one who's been actively doing something, which is, keeping John safe, make sure John's safe, and he, and he fails, because he finds John dead, and it's, I feel like that's, the most heartbreaking part of the film.
Yeah, and it's just, he's constantly reminding the other characters that Jamie is dead, and they can't go back, and there's nothing they can do about it. So it's the same idea with Matt, in this idea of, finding something in your life that you can try to control.
Yeah.
And, putting everything into that.
Yeah.
And, and obviously, it's acknowledged in the film with Matt that Lane takes things to extremes, It's something that they confront with their relationship.
Yeah.
Again, it's this thing that Lane feels like he can control, and then when he fails at that, in the end, it just causes this raw emotional experience. I feel like I kind of wanted to talk about John and Feck together, just because I feel like your understanding of both of them comes about at kind of the same time.
Yeah, I feel like John is, like, barely a character, honestly, until he starts talking to Feck, like...
Something that's interesting is that even though Feck is portrayed as just completely out of touch with reality, he has this sex doll that he has a name for and talks to, and... Ellie, and, he answers the door every time, pointing a gun out and saying checks in the mail. But there's something that's really interesting about both of them is that, even though it seems like Feck says a lot more, he's always just saying the same few things.
Yeah.
Until they get together. And so it's almost as if they are portrayed as really similar up into that point.
Yeah.
Because... John doesn't say much, but the things he does says are the same every time.
Yeah, and I feel like them together is really interesting because it does, like, it's the only time where I really, like, feel a lot of anger towards John, or, like, disdain towards John. Because of the way that they both talk about, like, their own murders. And you sort of, like, come to understand Feck is, like, that he's, like, haunted by this woman that he murdered. Like, we don't know the circumstance at all, but it's clear that he's, like, his guilt has, like, driven him in sort of, like, into this paranoid frenzy, and it's something that he, like, expresses remorse for and expresses love towards this girl, and, like, deep regret, and that's something that John just doesn't have, or at least he's pretending not to have. And something else that you were talking about where it doesn't really seem like any of the characters are truly afraid of John. And there's that one part when Feck and John are talking and, John kind of feels like him and Feck can sort of understand each other because they've both killed a woman. And so I think that's one thing that sort of gets him to start opening up more. But the first part is when, he's talking about his wife that he murdered, and he's like, I loved her. And, he tries to make that really clear, and he's like, did you love your girlfriend? And John just goes, she was okay. Yeah. And, I feel like from that point on, you feel genuine fear from Feck towards John. Yeah. Yeah, and, like, also, like, he, he's, like, talking about, like, doing stuff to Ellie, who is just a doll, but, like, it's, like, upsetting to Feck, because he, like, loves this doll.
Yeah. I mean, it's all that he has in this lonely house.
But I feel like something that's, like, interesting is that, like, I kind of feel like the way John talks about everything, it just, like, kind of feels like he almost, like, didn't even commit the murder. Like, maybe, like, he just, like, has wants the credit for it for whatever reason, and is, like, just trying to get reactions out of people. Like, I feel like that's, like, seems to be, like, more what's important than the murder at all,
Interesting.
Because, like, I feel like he does put weight in the reactions of people, but he doesn't, like, have much to say at all about her, like, actually committing the murder. It's, like, he's so much more interested in, like, other people's, reactions of him. Does that make sense? Or, like, the consequences that will come up.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely saw it as different, but I think that's very interesting. I guess I sort of, there is a point when Clarissa says that it's like he wants to be caught with the way that he's bragging about it, and I kind of always read John's journey as in that way. It's kind of like what we talked about with a certain film that I don't want to say because we're probably going to talk about it on the podcast, so I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but when we talked about it, it was just the idea of, I think that they're very different characters, but I think their journeys are actually very similar in the way that, it starts with doing something that there's, like, no going back on, and then sort of knowing that you have no hope and no future, and kind of having this break from reality of just not really giving a shit and doing whatever you can, whatever you want, that's, like, amoral, that, like, breaks laws, because, there's nothing else for you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think everything that John says when he's at the river's edge with Feck is true. And it's just this sort of idea that, he's done something that's gonna, what, like everybody says, he's gonna fry for. There's nothing he can do about it. He can't go back. Even if he doesn't really regret it at all, it's something with major consequences.
Yeah.
And so I feel like he sort of checks out throughout the entirety of the movie, because when he gets caught doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Because he's gonna.
Yeah.
Even though everyone in the film is portrayed as being sort of apathetic in a way, I think he has true apathy, and he's the only one that really does. When he's at the river's edge with Feck and he's talking about, killing her was the only thing that's, like, ever made him feel alive. That's the only time when I feel like I really believe his reasoning for doing what he did.
Yeah.
And even though it's fucking stupid, I think it's, I don't agree with it at all. It's the only thing that feels real and feels like it's really coming from him and he's not just totally checked out.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of journey of him just, completely disassociating from everything and then being with Feck and having the true aspects of his self, even though they're apathetic, really come out and him really face what he's done and how he feels about it, is really interesting to me.
Yeah.
And then, comparing that with Feck, it's just really interesting because, like you said, he's somebody that's so haunted by his past. He states clearly that he feels remorse for what he did. He's sorry, and to just sit with John and have him go on and on about how he did something horrible that he just doesn't regret at all because it's the only thing that's made him feel something.
Mm-hmm.
And, it just totally goes against his moral code because, he's haunted by what he did. It makes so much sense that he ended up killing John because there wasn't really any hope for him, I feel like he's the only character in the story that's truly hopeless.
Yeah.
As much as I feel like I can relate to this film a lot, as much as I feel like it's timeless, it still is a product of its time that I wasn't alive during. I've heard a lot of things about the youth of that time being very disaffected, apathetic, things like that, and it's sort of a stereotype, so I just wanted to find some more information about that. And so Generation X is the generation that's born anywhere between, I believe, 1965 and 1985, which would most likely be these characters, because it came out in 1986. And if you're sort of basing it off of that, so they would most likely be born in 1968 at the very earliest. So that stays within the birth time of Generation X. And so I found this article that's called Generation X, A Critical Sociological Perspective, and I thought it was really interesting and related a lot to the film. So the term Generation X actually has a really interesting history. So people born between 1965 and 1980 were at first called the post-baby boom generation. And the term Generation X actually started from this American war photographer whose name was Robert Capa. And he took this series of photographs of young people who had grown up during World War II and how they all had this common and justified disillusionment regarding their futures. And so he calls them Generation X because the X signifies this sort of placeholder waiting to be filled in. And so it's just the idea of this post-war future being so uncertain. So the next iteration of Generation X appeared in a small book by the same name. So it was written by the British journalists Jane Deverson and Charles Hamlet in 1964. And so it was sort of about the mod and rocker teenagers that were growing up in post-war Britain. And so the X was the idea of the unknown, that teenagers were a mystery, and also the idea of shock, like, you know, an X-rated film or something. So Generation X, you know, has become this sort of symbolic meaning of lost, unknown, disaffected, cynical.
I watched this documentary called Teenagers, and it was just like about like the birth of the term. And because it is like, it's not like, you know, an idea that was always around. There was like children and adults.
Yeah. Yeah, because I honestly didn't find out until semi-recently that the term teenager came about in like the mid-20th century, which is pretty wild because it's become something that's so defining.
Yeah.
So then it was this Canadian author, Douglas Coupland, who wrote this book, Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. This was in 1991. And so this sort of sealed the term Generation X into public culture. He drew upon the punk image of blankness for his notion of X. Also, Generation X was the name of Billy Idol's punk band. And so he wrote this sort of story that really countered these growing negative attributes that were defining Generation X and being made popular by films such as Slacker by Richard Linklater. Because I feel like the idea of generations is mostly aimed at talking about teenagers or youth. It's, you know, it encompasses at least, you know, 15 to 20 years of births. And so I think this idea of the disaffected youth definitely became really popular starting in the 1990s, like at the beginning of the 1990s. And I think that's why grunge became as popular as it did. Dan Lytle, who wrote this foreword in this book called Generation X Goes Global, Mapping a Youth Culture in Motion, talks about that the experience of Generation X is one of irony. He quotes, "We have given our lives to institutions and ideals that now seem like nothing more than imaginative musings, creative concoctions of hopeful days we may never see. In the United States, the centrality of television boosted idealistic images of happy families, while a rich education system promoted prosperous futures, and neither of them lived up to their promises. So while Generation Xers are often blamed for their failures, it was of no fault of their own that they grew up in a time of collapsing school systems and the death of a family, you know, high divorce rates and things like that, a lot of single parenthood."
I wonder, like, you know, coming out of like this like global pandemic, if there'll be like a new sort of youth culture that's like very definitive.
Definitely. But yeah, I think just a lot of things with this is that I think the whole idea of, you know, disaffected youth is something that's totally present in this film. You know, I think it totally encompasses the ideas that Generation X brought forward. The conclusion I actually found really great because the person that wrote this is a baby boomer, but they decided to have this conclusion by an actual Gen Xer. And I think this relates a lot to the whole dynamic between the teacher, you know, who grew up who was a teenager in the 60s during the countercultural revolution, and these students that are all Gen Xers. She says, I think we felt very much in the baby boomers' shadow, that our music was crap compared to theirs, that we weren't as iconoclastic or innovative or brave or revolutionary as they were, that they did youth right in the 1960s, and we would never measure up nor hear the end of it. I do occasionally feel grateful for having grown up in a weird in-between generation for whom there seemed to be low expectations and who mostly got left alone to make stuff up for themselves. So I think it is really interesting as well, because I think Generation X is kind of like this forgotten generation, because the generation after that, the millennials, were the internet generation. You know, they're so defined by high tech and not really living without the, you know, craziest invention of humanity, basically. But I really like the sort of thing that she was talking about of being in the baby boomer's shadow. You know, I think that there is a lot of truth in what the teacher says, but I think it totally reflects this idea that, you know, they're just constantly looking down upon these kids for, you know, not doing what they did.
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of the film also has to do with this idea of just low expectations and, you know, leaving these kids to figure things out for themselves, because that's kind of what the whole film is, you know? They never really talk to their parents for help in this situation, you know? They just are left to figure it out by themselves.
Yeah.
And as much as I feel like that sort of reflects what ends up being sort of selfish acts or just not really doing much, you know, it really is reflective of the idea that they don't really have anybody to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I wanted to talk about was sort of this whole idea of Generation X being this in-between generation, but also how it's kind of an idea that's timeless in a way. Because, you know, if they were born in, you know, 1968 at the very earliest, the Vietnam War ended in 1975, so, you know, they would have been children, like, super young during that time. And so they weren't as affected by it as people who were teenagers or adults were with the Vietnam War. And I think that's sort of a big push as to why they're sort of this disaffected generation. But I think that's a concept that spans across a lot of generations. One thing that it really reminded me of was when I read Please Kill Me, the uncensored oral history of punk. It's by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain. And something that really stuck with me in this book was when they were talking about Dee Dee Ramone and how he grew up in Germany. He was, I think he was born in Queens, and then his family relocated to Germany because I think his father was in the military, and so he lived on kind of like an army base camp. And he was really young at the time. You know, he was in like, I think like first grade or something. Something he got really into was, because this was after World War II, he was born in, I believe, 1951. So this was clearly post-war. He didn't live through it, but his parents did as, you know, young adults. And something he got really interested in living in Germany was finding, you know, remnants of World War II through rubble in Germany. And he would find a bunch of really crazy stuff like rusty machine guns, German steel helmets, gas masks, bayonets, and machine gun belts. He would even trade war relics with the kids in his housing complex, and he got really fascinated by Nazi symbols. He really loved finding them in the rubble, and he thought they were really pretty and glamorous, and his parents were super upset by that. And I think as well with sort of the birth of punk was this idea of disaffected youth, you know, people that didn't take anything seriously. And I think this sort of gives a little bit of humility to it in a way because, you know, he did not live through World War II at all. He was a child. He didn't know what, like, this Nazi symbol represented.
Mm-hmm.
And so it didn't really have the effect that it did with his parents. And, you know, so it's easy to sort of point these fingers when you lived through something really horrible and be like, you know, these kids just don't get it. They don't take anything seriously. And another thing that was really interesting was that Danny Fields sort of talks after about, like, Nazi symbolism in punk rock. And he says something that is definitely controversial. I'm not going to say that I agree with this, but I find it very interesting. And he says that it wasn't, oh, I'm a Nazi and all you Jews better watch out. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't political, it was sexual. I know that some people have trouble making the distinction nowadays, but it wasn't a racial threat. I mean, there's no one more conscious of the fact that my relatives, even though I never knew them, were wiped out by Nazis for being Jewish. And so there was this sort of idea of taking this Nazi symbol, you know, this anti-Semitic symbol, and using it for this sort of sexual, controversial element in your music and your way of being. And I think it just reflects a lot with this film, in the way that, you know, it's something that they just can't understand like the people that came before them did. Mm-hmm. And so they're able to look at these symbols and look at these ideas really objectively. They're able to use things for controversy in a way that, you know, living through that would be so much harder to do.
Yeah.
And there's something that I sort of relate to that in the way that, you know, I feel like I am from a sort of in-between generation because I was really young when 9/11 happened. Mm-hmm. And although I do have friends that do remember, you know, seeing it on TV or being really close to New York when that happened. I mean, I'm from Chicago, and I have zero memory of it. My parents have told me where I was and what I was doing, but I don't remember it at all. Yeah. And so that sort of experience doesn't really mean much to me. You know, that sounds kind of harsh, but it's kind of true, you know? I wasn't affected by it at all. And at the same time, you know, being in America, there's definitely been this nationalistic revival after 9/11, and I remember every single year in school on 9/11 we would talk about it and learn about it and, you know, share where we were and things like that, and, you know, talk about our own experiences or, you know, people we know who were there and mm-hmm. things like that. And you know, it felt like something that, you know, just like I can imagine with the kids in River's Edge, with the Vietnam War, or the New York punk scene with World War II, this sort of idea of it trying to be instilled in you every single year, you know, it's something that you can't escape, and so it sort of had this effect on me of just being angry and, like, feeling like, you know, something that once was a tragedy is now used just to, like, instill nationalism. And so I was able to look at the situation so much more objectively because I wasn't personally affected by it, mm-hmm. you know? And a lot of people could, you know, look at me as, you know, a disaffected youth, you know, somebody that is apathetic and doesn't take this thing seriously. And
yeah. And I feel like there's, like, an aspect of, like, you know, I'm sure there's, like, large groups of people in every generation that feel very disaffected and apathetic.
Definitely. Yeah. I think, you know, even though Generation X was definitely defined by that, I think it's something that spans so many generations.
Yeah. My first question is, who do you think is the moral conscience of this story?
That's a good question. I mean, morality is definitely very subjective. I guess, you know, something else that we've talked about a lot is, especially with, like, the idea of wish fulfillment and fantasy in films, there's sort of a different moral compass that you can follow when you're watching a fictional story or reading a fictional story.
Yeah.
And so I would say within this film, I would probably say Feck, because, I felt like John was kind of a threat to the world, the world of the film. He felt zero remorse for taking the life of a young girl who he really didn't have any good reason for doing at all,
Yeah.
because it made him feel good,
He's also, like, the only person who ever, like, expresses, like, actual, like, sadness, regret over, like, the bad thing he's done, you know?
Yeah, and so, I do not agree with the fact that Feck murdered his wife at all, but I do appreciate that he wishes that he didn't,
Yeah.
And I think I sort of, understand him taking John's life, because, if he didn't shoot him, John would be in jail for life.
Mm-hmm.
And some people could say, what's the difference?
Yeah.
And so he was just doing what he felt was right. But I think, I guess, in a more realistic or more connected with my own reality, I would say maybe like Matt or Clarissa, because I think that, it's a really sticky situation that they didn't really have any help in navigating, but they at least knew that what John did was wrong.
Yeah.
Which is something that nobody else really talked about.
Yeah.
What do you think was with the long fingernail with Jamie?
Oh, yeah, I noticed that too. I imagined it was like a coke nail.
Do you think that had any sort of defining of her in relation to others, or because that is kind of like it's a choice that the director made, and they made a choice to show it. So do you think there's any sort of reason why, outside of just maybe she did coke?
I don't know, because something I actually read about the film which was interesting is that they added a line in, apparently, about like Lane being an amphetamine freak, and that was something that they dubbed in later because the studio felt that it needed it to explain his behavior.
There is also a part when he's popping pills, which
Yeah.
I didn't really notice before.
Yeah. I don't think it really, like, means anything. I mean, the only other time, like, Jamie's, like, talked about is, like, when he says, when John is talking about killing her, and he says that she seemed a little stoned, but not, like, that surprised. But I don't know. I mean, like, she's such a nothing character. Like, what would it change? We don't know anything about her dynamic within the group other than that, like, nobody really cares that she's dead. Do you think if Keanu Reeves wasn't in this film, it would be as remembered today?
Nothing's remembered without Keanu Reeves. Maybe not, but I don't know. I don't think it would change the film, really. Like, I think that, not that he doesn't matter, I think he was a really good choice, and, he's really good at playing disaffected, stonery types. But I think if it was some other sort of stonery, softy boy, I think it still would have been just as good and just as important, even if it wasn't as remembered. What do you think would be added and taken away from the film if it was made today?
I think that something that might be added would be, like, parental presence. I don't know. I feel like there would obviously be, like, technology would be something that's added. I just feel like the idea of small towns are less now because of the internet and communication. And the idea of, like, people just being, so isolated in their friend group and doing their own thing without any parents doesn't exist anymore, really, I don't know. I feel like the fact that, like this, it's like, talking about the fact that it's like it's a girl that's been murdered and left naked would be something that was, like, more topical, often mentioned within the film, because I feel like that's something that's changed about cinema. My next question is, what films would you recommend people to watch next?
There's this one movie, The Doom Generation, which it came out in 1995 and it's filmed by Greg Araki, who's like a really noted queer filmmaker. It's about two troubled teens that are a couple and they pick up this adolescent drifter and together they embark on a sex and violence filled journey through America. And so I think the way that the characters are, I think the two start off at like some sort of punk or metal concert. And they're both kind of druggies, and they don't seem to have any sort of parental presence through the entirety of the film. And it's sort of similar to River's Edge in the way that it starts with this drifter that ends up killing someone. It's sort of in self-defense, but they feel like they have to just keep fleeing, which is why they go on this journey through America out of just fear of consequence. And so I think their attitudes towards a lot of things and just, not really being affected by these murders that keep happening and just their sort of indulgence in sex and drugs, and those sort of factors being more important than anything else that's going on, I think is really interesting. I guess in sort of talking about the whole thing of metal playing a big role, if there's any other kind of music that you think would work really well with it, or what would change about it if there wasn't the addition of metal music?
I don't think anything would change about it without the metal music. Because, there was something that was like an addition, that like came later, like in the process of making the film. So I don't think like it would feel any different, honestly, without it. But like if there was like another specific genre that they played, like pop, for example, like it would obviously be very different. It would be like weird. Thank you for listening. My name is Marika.
I'm Natalie.
And catch you on the flip side.